Gamers are faced with the age-old question, do you buy an additional console just to play the exclusives? But it wasn't always that way. There was a time when you could play exclusive games from the hottest console on the market on competitor hardware. Yes, the Atari VCS was the #1 console in video games for over a decade, but at the height of its success, Atari found a new hardware competitor, itself. Over a short period of time, the market was flooded with game adapters, add-ons, and outright clone consoles, allowing Atari games to be played on a staggering amount of different hardware systems, console designs, and brands. Never in the history of video games have you been able to play games on so many different hardware options being sold by Atari's biggest and sometimes smallest competitors. And I'm not talking about retro clones that come out decades after a console is discontinued. These all came out when the original was still on the market. It was a strange moment in video game history, something that likely won't ever happen again, and that story is coming up next. Hello heroes, 4K here with a special look at an obscure corner of video game history. When I was in 3rd grade, one of the hottest debates at school during lunch and recess was which was better, Atari or Intellivision. I had an Atari and my parents wouldn't spring for a new console, so I was loyal to the system. But even an Atari zombie like me had to notice that the newer consoles had better specs and better looking games. But Atari had one thing going for it, the staggering amount of games in its library. But that all changed when my neighbor got a ColecoVision. When he showed it to me, he pointed to the weird section sticking out in the front and told me that was the expansion module. I was like, what's that do? And he says it allows the ColecoVision to play any Atari game. As a kid in the 80s, my jaw hit the floor. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The last good argument for the Atari 2600 was suddenly inoperable. Atari's greatest strength was now a strength for the ColecoVision. His ColecoVision could play everything my Atari played, but could also play the vastly superior ColecoVision games like the amazing arcade ports the system was releasing. It was an earth-shaking moment in video games, the idea that console exclusives were no longer exclusive. So just how many different ways could you play Atari games in the 1980s? Well, obviously for starters, there was the Atari VCS itself, which had several console variations, initially released in late '77 with the Heavy Sixer, Sixer referring to the 6 switches across the front. And this is actually the second version, released in 1978, called the Light Sixer, due to the removal of some unneeded RF shielding, removing some of the weight of the original. In 1980, Atari released the first official revision to the console, but it was only minor cosmetic changes, like moving 2 of these switches to the rear of the console. And in 1982, they ditched the VCS's classic wood grain in favor of a sleek all-black model and changing the branding from Atari VCS to the Atari 2600, but fans just called it the Vader. But all of these are essentially the same console, branded by Atari, so we'll count all of those simply as one entry on our list. The first alternate branding of Atari's hardware was the Sears Video Arcade, but Sears wasn't a competitor, they were a business partner. Sears had a common practice of negotiating low-cost bulk orders from their suppliers to be rebranded as Sears products, sometimes sold for 5 or 10% cheaper than the original as a quote-unquote generic option. Sears had done the same thing with Atari's Pong console, rebranding it to Sears Telegames series of consoles, and continued to use the Telegames brand with their Video Arcade release. This type of corporate rebranding is still common practice today from retailers like Costco, which has their own in-house brand Kirkland, used to rebrand some products from their suppliers. Of course, the Video Arcade was essentially the same exact hardware as the original, with the one cosmetic difference in a change to a different wood grain. And for the hardcore trivia nerds out there, I believe it was a change from oak to walnut burl, but don't hold me to that because, damn it, Jim, I'm a journalist, not an arborist.
You can play most all the video games you've ever wanted to play. It's the video game system from Sears. You can play up to 371 video games, all on cartridges. This cartridge of 27 target games comes with it. And now the video game system from Sears is only $139.99. A super value for Christmas.
Well, Sears did mention in the promotional materials that the Video Arcade was compatible with Atari VCS games. The company really presented it as their own console, going so far as to have Atari develop different names and branding for the games themselves. However, Sears would grow to realize that alternate names could be a detriment, As you might expect, Sears sold 1979's Superman under the same name, for obvious reasons, and when the biggest hits came out, like Space Invaders and Adventure, it made little sense to obscure their pedigree. Eventually, Sears just dropped the alternate names for their games, and in 1982 discontinued the alternate Telegames brand altogether, but not before racking up over 50 games released under the alternate Sears branding. The partnership continued to be a success for both Sears and Atari, and Sears would continue to sell the video arcade into the mid-80s. But the next company that began to sell Atari hardware was of a more hostile nature. Their competitor, Coleco, who was not only coming out with an immensely more powerful console in the ColecoVision, but had also introduced the expansion module that would play Atari games. We already discussed how damaging this was to Atari's main competitive advantage, its massive game library. But adding insult to injury, Coleco was even promoting the expansion module in its commercials, using the pilfered Atari tech and game compatibility as a driver to sell more consoles.
Atari's video game Defender.
I played on ColecoVision.
Activision.
I played on ColecoVision.
Mattel's M Network and Imagic.
We played them on ColecoVision.
Introducing ColecoVision's first expansion module that lets you play all Atari 2600 compatible cartridges. And with all of ColecoVision's cartridges, that means you can play more games than any other video game system.
Atari execs like Ray Kassar must have been furious, and with the backing of parent company Warner Communications' deep pockets, promptly sued Coleco for patent infringement, with Coleco countersuing for antitrust violations. But here's where it gets a little more confusing. The common story goes that Coleco argued in court that the expansion module was based on off-the-shelf parts, so there was nothing proprietary to infringe upon. The story continues that Coleco beat Atari in the legal fight, which is why the expansion module came out and also opened the door for future Atari clones. The only problem is it's not true, even though it's become a popular misconception in the retro gaming community. Here's what really happened. Apparently, in one of the early court hearings, Coleco did win a positive judgment, and this is possibly how the misconception began. But of course, legal battles are a marathon, not a sprint. Evidence suggests that despite the early legal win, Coleco knew full well they were going to lose the case. Atari had him dead to rights. Yes, the VCS was mostly based on off-the-shelf parts, but the critical element was Atari's TV Interface Adapter, or TIA chip. The TIA was custom designed for Atari by J. Miner, and to clone an Atari, you needed a TIA chip. Despite their claims of not using any proprietary hardware, Coleco had found a company named VLSI Technologies, also known as just VTI, that had created a working copy of the TIA chip. Coleco entered into a contract with VTI, and that's how they were able to produce the expansion module. So despite their early court victory, Coleco was actually eager to sell with Atari, and surprisingly, Atari was too. You see, the year this all happened, the Atari VCS sold 4 million units, double that of the previous year, which was double of the previous before that. Atari's console sales were growing exponentially, and thus they likely didn't see the expansion module as much of a threat, and perhaps simply just an addition to their install base for selling games. Also, Coleco's early court victory might have led Atari to believe that while they'd no doubt beat Coleco, it might take a little longer and be a little more expensive than they originally thought. Regardless, Atari offered a surprisingly attractive settlement in which Coleco would begin to license the TIA chip, essentially making these two bitter rivals into business partners. And Coleco must have thought it was an attractive offer too. Not only did they agree to the terms, but they had big plans for the TIA chip. But more on that in a moment. So it's pretty clear this urban legend is not true, but it's surprisingly prevalent in the retro community. Here's a sample of just some of the examples I found on YouTube.
They did a lawsuit and took him to court and everything. However, this expansion module was not made using any Atari parts, so Atari ended up losing that battle, unfortunately.
But luckily, the judges agreed that as the add-on could be made entirely from off-the-shelf components, no copyright had actually been breached.
And of course Atari sued them, but Atari lost. And the reason was because Coleco used off-the-shelf parts. They didn't use any actual Atari parts.
And of course Atari sued, but Coleco ended up winning because their device was made with off-the-shelf components.
Now, there was obviously a lawsuit, and Coleco won because I guess apparently this was made with original parts.
And Atari filed suit claiming, that was illegal, you can't do that, blah, blah, blah. But a judge ruled that, look man, Atari, you put no custom parts inside the 2600.
Since the Atari 2600 could be reproduced with standard parts, this was legal.
Now, I don't mean to call out all those YouTubers. They all have great channels, and I'm a big fan of some of them and watch them regularly and use them for sources of information on video game history. In fact, you can check out links to all their channels in the pinned comment below. But it shows how common this false myth is. And I'll admit, I thought the same exact thing they did for years until I started researching the topic a year or two ago. So how did we all get it so wrong? Well, we may never know definitively, but before you start saying it's the Mandela effect, I have a possible explanation for how it got started in the first place. You see, it is true that Atari was beaten in court in a lawsuit over patent infringement. Only it wasn't Coleco that beat them, it was Activision. A couple of years before Coleco entered the console market, for cartridge-based consoles anyways, Atari had filed a lawsuit over Activision's unlicensed third-party game cartridges for the VCS. Atari lost big time. Yes, their console's TIA chip was proprietary, but nothing in the actual game cartridges was proprietary. The cartridges were really made from off-the-shelf parts. Atari then tried to claim that Activision's founders, who were former Atari VCS programmers, had used Atari's trade secrets to form the competing company. But now standing on weaker ground, Atari ended up settling with Activision, and the third-party game was born. It wasn't a complete and total victory. A little-known part of the settlement was that Activision would pay Atari royalties on cartridges sold. Still, it was a big win and established third-party games, so it's quite possible this victory against Atari is mistakenly thought of and projected onto Coleco's legal efforts. So there you have it, myth busted. But I suppose there could be another reason why people just assumed that Coleco had won, because Atari hardware began to pop up everywhere, including once again from Coleco, turning their expansion module into the Coleco Gemini, a separate complete Atari clone console. Coleco had been planning the Gemini long before their settlement with Atari. The expansion module itself was basically a complete Atari clone, as it didn't use any processing power from the base console. The module only used the ColecoVision as a power supply and for video output. So early on in the module's development, Coleco saw that they could easily revamp it as its own freestanding console, which they felt they could produce more cheaply and undercut Atari in price, much like they did with their Pong consoles in the late 70s. In the end, it wasn't much cheaper at all, so Coleco decided to sell it for about the same price, but with a free second controller, a free game, and $25 in coupons for more games. Even the controller itself was seen as a cost savings, as it combined both a paddle and joystick controller into one, so it was almost like getting 4 controllers. But like the ColecoVision, the Gemini's real ace in the hole may have been its pack-in title.
It's about the same price.
And Gemini comes with Donkey Kong.
Hey, this joystick plays better than Atari. And you get a built-in paddle.
And coupons worth $25 for all these arcade cartridges.
Because you have to realize just how much of a monster hit the Donkey Kong arcade game was at the time, and people wanted to play that game at home any way they could. If gamers already owned an Atari or just couldn't afford a ColecoVision, you might be surprised how many of them were happy to get this inferior Atari port. That's something I personally remember. Everybody wanted the hottest arcade games on their home consoles, even those crappy Atari versions of them. So for those price-conscious consumers, the Gemini with its extras was an attractive package, and in some cases, like this Canadian release, it included Donkey Kong and another arcade port, Mousetrap. Of course, the pack-in games didn't really make any difference. The Gemini ended up being a failure, largely because it came out too late, right in the middle of the video game crash, which was a common theme for the hardware that we're looking at today. Today, the Gemini is seen as little more than a curio of the second generation of consoles, known as an inferior clone with lower build quality that often leads to video output ports and controller ports to fail.
This has a little loose controller ports on it. Some little weaknesses of the Gemini.
But it has its fans, and the unique controllers have both their detractors and some very vocal defenders. And amazingly, Coleco wasn't done with their work on Atari clones. But the next iteration would come from another corporate partnership, this time with CBS Electronics. CBS was already in the video games industry as the European distributor for the ColecoVision, and when the company's subsidiary Columbia House wanted to create a video game version of their profitable music subscription service, CBS approached Coleco. The resulting partnership led to Coleco making extra units of the Gemini to be rebranded and sold as the Columbia Home Video Arcade, just like Atari had done with the Sears Video Arcade. That's right, Atari licensed the TIA chip to Coleco, who again licensed it to Columbia House, all while the Atari VCS was still on the market. You can't make it up. Unfortunately for Columbia House, they were even later into the market, and even further into the video game crash, resulting in a short life for the home video arcade, ironically making it one of the rarest versions of the Atari console in the collector's market. Not expensive, but rare. And when Coleco dived into their work on Atari clones with the expansion module, the other big name in video games at the time, Intellivision, was feeling a bit threatened and left out of the action. Before the ColecoVision, the Intellivision was in a solid but distant second place behind Atari in console sales, but it dominated the higher tech, higher cost end of the market. But the ColecoVision had even better hardware and at a lower price than the Intellivision. Clearly, Coleco was gunning for that higher-end market and with a devastating price advantage. But Intellivision had one advantage of their own. Having been released 2 years earlier, it had a head start that led to it building up a game library of over 24 titles, compared to just a handful of games when the ColecoVision launched. Of course, that all changed with the ColecoVision's expansion module. However, Intellivision knew that with their larger first-party library, if they could also release an add-on that it played Atari games, then Intellivision would be able to say they were the console with the biggest game library in the industry. And so they went to VTI to get the TIA chip and presumably signed onto the same licensing deal with Atari, and thus the Intellivision system changer was born. But it was a bit of a bumpy rollout. The add-on was designed to complement the newly redesigned Intellivision 2 console, so it looked pretty awkward with the original version of the console. But even worse, it technically wasn't even compatible with the original console, which wasn't designed to accept an external video signal from the cartridge slot. To use the system changer with an original Intellivision, you needed to ship it to a service dealer for a modification to the motherboard. So the Intellivision did get their adapter to market, if a bit clumsily, giving its console the coveted bragging rights of largest game library, but it was a hollow victory. Like the Gemini and home video arcade, the video game crash doomed the peripheral, leading to its quick cancellation with only a small quantity produced, and is another rare item on the collector market. And this one pretty expensive. But there was yet another company looking to add an Atari clone add-on to its console. Atari itself, with its new next-gen console, the 5200, but that didn't go quite as well as they'd hoped either. When the 5200 came out, it was the first time a brand had come out with a second console, and so gamers that had bought stacks of 2600 games felt, perhaps unfairly, that the console should be able to play older games as well. However, Atari sprung into action to meet this demand and had developed their own system changer add-on for the 5200 called the VCS cartridge adapter. Unfortunately for Atari, they ran into some technical problems during the development, specifically with the 5200's 36-pin cartridge slot. The compatibility issue caused the adapter to electrically damage the 5200. The problem was resolved, but not until well after the console's launch. Of course, gamers didn't know all that behind-the-scenes stuff, and what they did know seemed like a slap in the face. After clamoring for backwards compatibility, and after shelling out more cash for the more expensive 5200, owners now saw that they couldn't play 2600 games, but ColecoVision owners could, and Intellivision owners soon would as well. It was an insult to the loyal Atari owners that spent the extra dough for the new console. When the 5200's cartridge adapter did finally come out, it almost seemed to fans as if Atari had been forced or guilted into it, or that the supposed market leader was scrambling to keep up with the competition. Many gamers that had held off on buying a new system were suddenly a little less loyal to Atari and starting to eye the significantly cheaper ColecoVision. Ironically, the whole debacle almost never happened because early in the 5200's development, there were two competing designs for the 5200, one of which natively played 2600 games, no adapter required. But the backwards compatibility design was simply dropped in favor of the other for some unknown reason, and in a way that decision led to the whole adapter disaster years later. But there's one more crazy twist in the backwards compatibility rivalry between Atari and Coleco. In 2017, Atari Age forum user Dutchman2000 posted that he had recently purchased a cache of old paperwork from Atari, in which he found a memo from December 1983 discussing the possibility of an updated Super 5200 console that would amazingly be compatible with 2600 games, 5200 games, and ColecoVision games. Dutchman2000 hasn't released scans of the memo, citing an agreement with the original owner, and there are a few puzzling things about the memo, so hopefully we'll get to see it and maybe even unearth new documents that might answer some of those lingering questions. Still, it's crazy to think that after the Gemini and the expansion module, Atari was apparently considering turning the tables on Coleco in the clone game. Another console designed for the VCS would come out when Sears released its Video Arcade 2, an update to their old Video Arcade that for the first time was actually a redesign of the console original. Smaller and sleek and a more modern look. It also had an LED power light, one of the first to have that feature. The console was actually a rebranded version of the Atari 2800, which was designed for the Japanese market, so we're not counting that one on our list. The 2800 was a near and instantaneous failure in the Japanese market, making it an incredibly rare and expensive item today, but Sears loved the design so much they thought it would make a great revamped video arcade. And the controllers were also different from any 2600. They were actually modeled after the 5200 controllers, using a fully rotational spinner built into the stalk of the joystick. It's essentially the 5200 controller with the keypad buttons removed. But with these new controllers, the new case design, the LED light, the video arcade was almost starting to feel like its own console that actually offered something different and in a way better than the original it was based on. This radically new-looking video arcade appeared in 1983, but the Atari 2600 itself wouldn't get its first real console redesign until 1986, a decade into its lifespan. At least part of the reason why it took so long was due to Warner Communications selling Atari during the crash to former Commodore honcho Jack Tramiel, who had immediately halted all hardware projects while he tried to slash expenses. Consoles Atari had developed and produced were left languishing on the shelf until Atari sprung back to life in 1986 with the redesign of the 2600. It soon became known as the Atari Junior due to the much smaller console design, and at first glance it appears to be influenced by the Japanese Atari 2800, just like the Sears Video Arcade. But actually the design comes from another canceled project, one that never even got off the drawing board. The Voice Commander module, a joint venture with Milton Bradley for a proposed 2600 peripheral that would give the system voice recognition, which was to be used for voice-activated game controls. However, the Voice Commander was canceled fairly early in development and no prototype is known to exist. Voice-controlled games, that might have been pretty cool.
Fire! 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 Fire!
Or maybe not. Anyway, the Voice Commander module's console design lived on in the Atari Junior, which was actually a success, despite launching opposite Nintendo's juggernaut, the NES. Of course, Nintendo dominated the sales charts, but the small repackaged nostalgia of the Junior was budget priced at under $50 and was popular with consumers not quite ready to shell out the big bucks to get back into video gaming.
And one more thing, it's got a special low price, under $50. $50? The fun is back!
The success of the Atari Junior bolstered Atari's confidence in the resurgence of the console market, and in 1987 they would follow up the Junior with the release of another console that had been sitting on the shelf, the Atari 7800, the long-delayed follow-up to the 5200. But this time the 7800 had backwards compatibility to the 2600 built into the system natively. The 7800 was in development back during the 5200 system changer debacle, which no doubt informed the decision to include the feature in the 7800. And in a wonderful twist of fate, during development of the 7800, one of the companies Atari enlisted to help was VLSI Technologies. Yes, VTI, the company that had copied Atari's TIA chip, leading to the lawsuit with Coleco, ended up working for Atari on their next console. Strange times indeed. While the 7800 was never going to seriously challenge Nintendo's massive market share, it did sell fairly well. Coming in at about $80, it was still under half the cost of the NES, and was a moderate success for Atari. Ironically, it was everything gamers wanted back in 1982, a more powerful system, it didn't have those awful 5200 controllers, and it had backwards compatibility right out of the box. This has led some modern gamers to suggest that had the 7800 been released instead of the 5200, the likely stronger sales might have helped Atari weather their financial troubles in 1983, possibly minimizing the market crash and saving the industry. But for the 7800's eventual release in 1987, the value of features like backwards compatibility with decade-old hardware had dropped considerably. By that time, there were 20 million 2600 consoles sold, and the Atari Jr. was still on the shelves and selling well, so it's difficult to say how much impact the compatibility feature had on sales as late as 1987. But looking back from today, the 7800's backwards compatibility is a beloved feature among enthusiasts of original hardware. The 7800 is a favorite among retro gamers due to its better video output, or those wanting to avoid buying an extra console, or just prefer the simplicity of only hooking up one system to their TV to play two different game consoles. But if you think all of these clones, adapters, and rebrandings were strange, just consider what might have been. For example, have you ever felt the burning desire to play Atari 2600 games on your Commodore VIC-20 computer? I know, who hasn't? Well, in 1983, someone decided to satiate that desire, namely the people at Cardco, who put out a series of ads promoting the Cardco Cardaptor, which was basically the same thing as the cartridge adapters for ColecoVision and the 5200 and Intellivision. At least that was the plan. Despite the ads appearing in computer magazines that year, the Cardaptor has become known in the Commodore community as an infamous example of Vaporware. While the ads appeared in several publications, no existing evidence of the Cardaptor has ever surfaced. Despite advertising for a non-existent product, Cardco was a well-known company among Commodore 64 users for their adapters that allowed third-party printers and cassette storage to be used with the computer system. I also found this review for some tax software Cardco made for the 64 in 1985, but with the decline of the Commodore, Cardco declined as well, going out of business the following year. But apparently the demand to play Atari on your VIC-20 was strong, as yet another attempt was made by Protecto Enterprises, who called their adapter the Game Loader, not to be confused with the 2600's third-party accessory of the same name. Protecto was another company known in computing circles at the time. They made a business out of buying out discontinued hardware to distribute through their discount retailers. For example, Protecto scooped up the remaining stock of APF consoles and computers when that company went out of business. But with the VIC-20 adapter, Protecto didn't fare any better than Cardco did, and the Game Loader also disappeared into the ether before it even arrived. Once again, Vaporware. All those VIC-20 owners were simply deprived of all that Atari goodness. Of course, you can't feel too bad for them. As this video has shown, there were plenty of other options available. But I've saved the strangest bit of Atari clone legends for last, because around the time the 7800 was first being developed, a new video game console was announced that was going to be everything gamers had ever wanted. The Ultravision Video Arcade, a powerful new console that could function as a cutting-edge computer through the optional keyboard. And it had a built-in color television, hi-fi audio jack for headphones, and could even run on DC power for use in vans, RVs, and boats. And it could even run on battery power, making it the first ever completely self-contained and portable video game system with a screen. And they promised add-on system adapters to make the Ultravision compatible with ColecoVision games, and yes, Atari 2600 games. It seemed like a Frankenstein's monster of gaming and computing ideas stitched into one piece, but the capabilities it promised certainly piqued curiosity of gamers when the ads promoting the system began appearing in 1982. The ads continued into 1983 for a proposed launch later that year, promising a slate of next-gen games for the console's launch. However, by mid-1983, the ads simply stopped appearing, leaving confused game journalists wondering what happened. The Ultravision was never heard from again, with no working prototype ever known to exist, leading many to speculate that the ad campaign was simply an attempt to drum up investment capital. Call it the first video game Kickstarter scam before Kickstarter scams existed. But could there be more to the story? Ultravision was a real company. They released 2 games for the Atari 2600, Condor Attack and Karate. However, their Atari releases certainly wouldn't give you confidence in the company. They're both famously awful games, with Karate known for its unplayable controls and Condor Attack for being a low-quality ripoff of Atari's Phoenix and perhaps a little bit of Imagic's Demon Attack. So, is it possible that Ultravision was real? To find out, I had to consult my colleague from the UK, YouTube channel Laird's Lair, who actually discovered the secret origins of the Ultravision. So let's go to Laird himself to find out the story.
This research led me to creating a video on the very subject, with the story of the unreleased Ultravision video arcade system being published on my own YouTube channel, The Laird's Lair, in November last year. In the video, I revealed that the Ultravision was in fact a fully licensed version of an existing German console that was already in development, called the Funvision F311. I also talked about Funvision themselves, a company who were already known for producing clone consoles based on both the Interton VC4000 and Atari 2600, as well as a number of games for the latter such as Spider Kong, Panda Quest and Year 1999. In fact, this is the origin of both Condor Attack and Karate by Ultravision, as well as many of the other games that they announced in their advertising. After confirming the links between Funvision in Germany and Ultravision in Miami, Florida, I speculated on what the Ultravision actually was. Now, most people seem to be of the opinion that it was nothing more than an Atari 2600 clone, but this made no sense at all, when you consider how Ultravision both described it and advertised it. I then gave my informed opinion that the console it really cloned was in fact the ColecoVision. This was based on several firm pieces of evidence, including the fact that the Ultravision was mooted as being able to play ColecoVision cartridges, that it featured advanced graphics and sound, which for the time the ColecoVision did, and finally the boast that the Ultravision could be converted into a full-blown home computer. Those of you who know anything about the ColecoVision will be more than aware that it was based on the MSX standard, a common home computer format designed by Microsoft, Spectra Video and the ASCII Corporation, years before the IBM PC compatible became a thing. And that is pretty much where the story ended, because I had exhausted all of my routes of research. But then a few months later I found myself researching another documentary and made an incredibly important discovery. The system in question this time was VTech's obscure CreativeVision console. Although the CreativeVision was developed, manufactured and marketed around the world by Hong Kong electronics giant VTech, who have become particularly well known for their educational kids consoles, it was also licensed out to several regional distributors too. These companies included Australian retailer Dick Smith Electronics, who rebranded it as The Wizard, EduCat in Israel, and most importantly, Funvision in Germany. Yes, that Funvision. Now, when you also consider that the CreativeVision hardware was so similar to the ColecoVision that it actually had an adapter to play its games, I think we've solved the mystery. The Funvision boasted adapters to play ColecoVision and Atari 2600 games, the CreativeVision had such an adapter, and the ColecoVision already had the expansion module to play 2600 games. You will also be interested to learn that there was also a computer add-on for the CreativeVision as well as an actual computer based on the same hardware called the VTech Laser 2001. Remember the Ultravision also boasting it could be turned into a home computer? Last of all, which very much pins down the final part of the story, Funvision were in fact a wholly owned European subsidiary of VTech. Case closed. And that, my friends, is the Ultravision mystery solved once and for all. It wasn't a clone of the 2600 or indeed the ColecoVision. It was in fact a VTech CreativeVision with a built-in screen and a whole host of expansion opportunities. Please make sure you check out the Laird's Lair for more interesting retro stories, and I hope to see you all again very soon.
So as Laird said, it turns out the Ultravision was actually more real than any of us had imagined. Regardless, it was a fascinating footnote to video game history, if only for what it would have meant to the history of portable games. I have to admit it, I find the Ultravision fascinating because it was so crazy, but I found a lot in this video that was pretty crazy. We've covered 10 different hardware systems that played the Atari, in a sense competing with the original, and most amazingly, 7 of them, 7, were on the market at the same time. Consoles with different names, different shapes, and different companies, sometimes even with different features, all competing for the same customers, and incredibly, many of them competing for the same shelf space in the same stores. It's an amazing and bizarre footnote in the history of games, one that probably won't ever be replicated again. And if you find this bit of obscure Atari trivia interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing the video with your friends on social media, or check out my video on the crazy history of mechanical Pong, mechanical rip-offs of the video game for home consoles, in arcades, and even handhelds. Link in the upper right corner. Hope to see you here again on Hero Journalism.